All right, so just wanted to give you guys a final review, even though we weren't able to meet because of the inclement weather. We got pushed back. We had to take our final exam, or our last in-class exam or semester exam. But I did want to go over some things about the course before you took the final exam. So remember, make sure you know when the final exam is so that you are there. It is earlier. We have to do it based on the final exam schedule and the time slot that the college gives us for our course. So we started out the course talking about the scientific method, and with the scientific method, it's really how is science conducted. And in high school, we talk about it as being like a list of steps, and you always go through this order. But really, you can jump around, and in real science, it's not this sterile environment where we're just always going exactly in the same order. But it's kind of this cycle where we might start out with a question, and then we're going to go and we're going to research it and try to figure out, what do we know, what do we not know, and then ultimately, after we've done some research and we've used our reputable sources. Remember, when we talk about reputable sources, we're talking about using peer-reviewed articles, sometimes called scholarly articles. These scholarly peer-reviewed articles are going to be our sources of information rather than something like a Wikipedia or even like a CNN.com, NBC.com, or a blog by someone. Bill Nye's science blog. It might sound reputable because you think, oh, Bill Nye, he's the science guy. He is well versed. He's not going to put anything. But really, we want to go to the legitimate scientists that are at institutions, that are at organizations that are doing the actual research themselves. And after that, then we're going to come up with a hypothesis. And then from the hypothesis, we're going to come up with a list of methods and materials we're going to use so that we can have a procedure. And then ultimately, we're going to record our results and hopefully come up with some kind of conclusion. Now, the conclusion doesn't always have to support the hypothesis. A lot of times it rejects the hypothesis, but we'll come up with some conclusion, either that we're accepting or rejecting the hypothesis. And we're often going to then discuss what is going to come next. What does the conclusion really mean? Can we now test another hypothesis, or do we have to go back to the drawing boards, or do we have a new question? So this is kind of, but as much as in high school we talk about it being a list of steps, it's really something that you can get to a certain point. You get to a conclusion, and then you find out, what, we want to go back to research and we want to start all over again and jump around. So not necessarily the same way that it's taught in high school. Now, we like to have controlled experiments. Now, a lot of times when we go into the field, if you're trying to count how many of a specific organism is in a certain lake or something like that, you're not going to be able to empty that lake, take the lake with you, put it in a lab, control all the variables. So a lot of times, it's not going to be as easy as that. But we like to do what we call controlled experiments, where we're able to control all the variables except the one. All right, except the one. So we only like to change one variable at a time. When we change that one variable, that's the variable that we're testing for. So when you think about testing for a medication, new medication that's going to come out, you're not going to, if you're trying to come out with two medications, you're not going to give them two different medications. Or if you want to see what the influence of taking vitamin B supplements and vitamin C supplements are on taking those while you're taking this new medication, well, you're not going to give the person the medication and the vitamin C and the vitamin B at the same time. You first give them the C and see what the results are, and then another group you can give the B and see what the results are, and then you're going to have your control group that's not going to get any vitamin supplements, so that you have that for a comparison. So remember, when you're doing a controlled experiment, only one variable is going to be changed. We want to limit the change that's going on in the experiment, so that we know that if there's any differences in data that's collected, it's because of that one variable that we tinkered with or that we changed with. So we're gonna make an experiment, and anytime you make an experiment, you want to make sure that you have the best results. And to make the best results, you are going to have as big of a sample size as possible, and ultimately we like to say that we're going to collect more data, collect as much data as possible so that we can prove that our results really are significant. Now, in science, we often talk about laws and theories, and in chemistry and physics, you hear about laws, and in those subjects, there's different laws because they're able to prove some of the ideas that are within that discipline. But with biology, a lot of things kind of have nuances and exceptions and things that we can't necessarily prove. So a big one, something that you want to know is this idea of this word theory. So we don't call it a law. A law is something that I like to say that we know for 100%. We can prove it. I can show it to you. Well, theory, okay, not necessarily something that's 100% because I can't show it to you. So evolution, I can't go back 4.6 billion years and show you every year throughout time how things have changed over time. I can't do that. I can put together as much evidence as possible, and I can ultimately prove it to you, but I can't quite show you it. So I can't say for 100%, maybe we'd say 99.9%, but can't do that full 100%. There's always that possibility of us doing it wrong. So we call that a theory. So a theory of evolution doesn't mean this word theory where we, in common language, we say theory like, oh, I have a theory about my roommate that he doesn't do any of the dishes because he thinks I'll do it. Well, that's not a theory. That's just you kind of coming up with a guess as to why something's going on. But it's not a guess. When we say it in science, if we're a scientific theory, that's something that is going to be backed by a lot of evidence. So the theory of evolution, it's not just, oh, it's some idea we came up with and maybe it explains it, but it's actually something that has a lot of evidence to it, and the evidence supports that theory. And just remember, when we're talking about anything, we are using our reputable sources. Evolution, the course is all about evolution. That's what life on Earth is about. This is a non-majors science course all about evolution. So remember, Earth is approximately 4.6 billion years old. And in those 4.6 billion years, we have gone from a place that is this weird abyss that doesn't have any life all the way up to where we are today, where we have a lot of complex organisms and a lot of diversity in the organisms. And evolution, this term is really, it just really means a change over a long period of time. Things have been evolving, and when we talk about evolution, it's not this short thing that's going to happen in one generation or two generations. It's over, really, ultimately, the big changes that we see are over millions of years. So when we talk about evolutions, we say that populations evolve. Well, what does that mean? Well, if an individual ends up to be different, well, we don't say that individual evolved. We usually say that individual has a mutation, has a new trait, some kind of adaptation. They've changed in some way, but we don't call that evolution. It isn't until you see that new trait, that mutation, in a vast amount of the organisms in that population that we say that they have evolved. So once they have changed, where that whole population ultimately has that trait or has the ability to have that trait, or somewhere in their lineage they have that trait, we are going to say that it's evolution. So individuals don't evolve. There's a change in an individual. It might be a mutation, and mutations can lead to evolving, can lead to a whole population having that mutation. But when it's just one individual, we call that mutations. If it's a population, that's when we say that they evolve. So individuals don't evolve, populations evolve. And evolution is driven by natural selection, and natural selection is really controlled by the environment and the pressures that the environment, the stressors that the environment are going to put on those populations and those communities of organisms. Darwin often discussed this idea of descent with modification. So as time goes on, as these lineages continue, you are coming from your parents. All organisms come from a parent, and you might not be exactly like your parent, but you are descending from your parent with a little bit of modification, and over millions and millions of years, you're going to see those big changes. So it's not like one organism ends up having an organism that's completely different. It's little modifications. You're descending from an organism. You're having a lot of the same traits, but you're having little modifications along the way, and over time, those pile up, and you're ultimately going to have that evolution. So Darwin didn't say this term evolution so much. He said more so he talked about natural selection and descent with modification. Those were the big terms that he talked about. And the ultimate goal, we always think about, oh yeah, it's going to be, so that you can have all the food around. You're the best at getting the food. Well, not necessarily true in all cases. Really, it's a matter of if you can reproduce. If you are able to reproduce, that's all that matters. So if you have some trait that kills you or after you reproduce, well, we're not going to weed out those traits, and we're not going to say that you're not fit, and that doesn't mean that you're not going to be able to live for millions and millions of years, or you as an organism, your population is going to be able to live for millions and millions of years, because it doesn't hinder your ability to reproduce. So really, as much as we like to say is it's all about being fit, but really it's about being able to reproduce. Ultimately, they kind of go hand in hand. So traits that allow you to reproduce are really what makes a trait fit or not necessarily what we think would help them, prosper really well. So you don't have to be the best, but if you can reproduce, then that's what's going to help you to live long enough and pass on those traits. And that's what it's all about, passing on those genes, passing on that DNA, passing on those traits to the next generation. Now, when we talk about natural selection, we then bring in this idea of artificial selection. Artificial selection is something that we do. So natural selection, nature is doing the selecting. But with artificial selection, it's humans are doing the selecting. So you see, like with things like pit bulls, all right, we are selecting for traits so that we get big pit bulls that are able to fight each other. All right, plants, we're selecting for traits that are going to make better plants, bigger corn husks, better leaves, whatever it may be. We're selecting for traits, and any plants that don't have those traits, we're not planting the seeds from them. And any plants that are nice, we're taking those seeds and we're planting them. And over a long period of time, we're ultimately selecting for traits and making organisms change over time ourselves. In this course, you do want to know a little bit about DNA, or a little bit about genetics. You have to understand that DNA is the genetic code that's ultimately holding the instructions for building proteins. So, DNA, it is the instructions that makes us. How does that make us? Because we're made of proteins, and the DNA is going to code for or give the instructions for how to build all these proteins that make us up. Changes in DNA are called mutations. So whenever we talk about an error or a change in the DNA, that's going to be referred to as a mutation. And mutations are important because as much as we talk about them, a lot of times you hear about them in this negative sense. It's not always a negative thing. Some mutations bring on good things that can help us survive in an environment, especially a changing environment. So mutations can be a good thing, and they lead to new traits, and new traits can help us survive better. Some new traits might be bad. They're going to not help us survive. We're going to have, it'll not help that organism. They might die off. But the organisms that get the good mutations, the helpful mutations, the better traits, they're going to hang on to those, and they're going to pass them on, and it's going to help them to survive longer and reproduce more and keep their lineage going. Phylogeny, we talked about phylogenetic trees. I'm not really going to go over that. It's really about understanding the diagram. So if you don't know about phylogenetic trees, if you had trouble with phylogenetic trees, then I would go back and study and look at phylogenetic trees more. But, there are those diagrams that I've given you, and that you're going to see them again, that are showing the lineages. They're showing the branches of the organisms and the way that they change over time, and how they branched off into different species, and they got different traits over time. So, we see with speciation, phylogeny, that over time things are branching off and changing. Moving to new locations can cause a change in the genetics of the population, and that's ultimately because it creates gene flow in the genetics or in the genome of that specific species. We talked about nomenclature. Remember how it's written: italics, first letter of the first word is capitalized, the rest are lowercase letters. Easy enough. When we talk about speciation, Darwin wrote about the beak shape and the size of the finches of the Galapagos Islands. He talked about how they came from one common ancestor and they became different species. When we look further into speciation, and we discussed this, we had discussions, we talked about kind of the nuances that deal with speciation. Remember, speciation is very complicated. There's plenty of examples where we're kind of not sure. Are they two different species? Are they the same species? Once upon a time, people say, oh, if they're able to breed together, they're the same species. If they are going to live together, they're the same species. Those type of things, they sound great, but then you find these examples. One example is that, you have dogs, you have wolves, you have coyotes. They're all able to interbreed, but are they the same species? So something like the western coyote and the eastern coyote, or sometimes the eastern coyote is called the coy wolf or coy dog. You hear all these different terms to describe it, but are they different species? Well, they can interbreed. They share similar DNA. Are they different species? That's a nuance right there that it makes things very difficult. Another example is when you talk about different populations of Eurasian blackcaps. Some people say, hey, they're all Eurasian blackcaps, but then other people say, hey, there's different populations of them. They've been separate for a while. How are they still the same species? So those nuances kind of make this idea of speciation, by this idea of separating different organisms into different species, is more complicated than you would think. So we also talked about two books. The first book we talked about was Your Inner Fish by Neil Shubin, and he was looking for these transitional species, and the big transitional species that he talked about was Tiktaalik. And he talked about, his whole journey in trying to find fossils, and he said that, the hard part is you're trying to find fossils, and you can only find fossils in sedimentary rock. And once you find your sedimentary rock, they also have to be rocks of the right age when you're looking for a certain organism that lived during a certain time, and they have to have the right exposure. We have to be able to access them. So that makes it difficult to find the fossils, the specific fossils that you might be looking for. So many things change in the climate to lead to drastic changes in the organism. Remember that the environment is ultimately influencing natural selection, which is changing evolution. And things like, you see oxygen levels increased over time in the history of the Earth, and that led to multicellular organisms being able to suddenly appear and prosper. Carbon dioxide has changed over the last 200 years. It's increased over the last 200 years, and that's going to lead to climate change. That could ultimately lead to mass extinction, and not anytime soon, but in the future. So Tiktaalik, the scientific name or the nomenclature that we use is Tiktaalik rosé, and that is the one that the book is really all about. So talked about how he saw the transition from fish to amphibians, really, or one of those transitional species that really showed how the progression really moved on from fish to like a ichthyostega type organism. So the book spoke a lot about different structures that were the same between different organisms, the same between us and fish, us and amphibians, us and reptiles, whatever it may be. And really it points back to this idea of homologous structures, and that really was the big thing that Sir Richard Owens talked about. Sir Richard Owens noticed that, hey, if you look at something like the arm, right, it's very similar from one organism to the next. They don't look the same, really, and even when you look at the bones, the bones don't necessarily look the same, but the structures, it has a similar kind of breakdown to it, where you have a big one up top, you have two rod-like ones, then you have a bunch of little ones that look like pebbles, and then you have these rods that make up your metacarpals and your phalanges. Teeth. Talked about teeth, how they ultimately were very important because they gave rise to this ability to make different types of features to an organism, right? Being able to make teeth meant that now we also have a way to make hair. We also have a way to make feathers. We have a way to make scales. We even have a way to make glands, which completely changed the way that organisms were. Now you're not having these simple fish-like things, but you're having things that are going to have hair and scales and feathers and glands, which are extremely important. You think about us, we have hair, we have glands. If we didn't have those things, we wouldn't be where we are today, and that all goes back to the way that teeth are formed, all right? But once we evolved the ability to form teeth, then we also had this mode of how to make new things, and hair, feathers, scales, and glands are all other examples that came from the same idea of how teeth are made. So another thing he talked about is the inner ear, how important it is for maintaining balance. Obviously, very important in hearing, but also for maintaining balance. Remember, we talked about, what gets thrown off is that inner ear is thrown off, and that's why when you drink, and even when you're hungover, your balance is off. So the shift, after we talked about the your inner fish, then we talked about the story of the human body by Daniel Lieberman, and he talks about the shift from apes to humans points to this idea that there must have been a change in the environment. We must have been cast out from the jungle as the jungle started to shrink, and when we were cast out from that jungle, then we had to adapt, and that led to the changes from us being apes to humans. And that's also why there are still apes, because they're still in those areas and we moved out of those areas. A big thing in this book is he talks about the mismatch hypothesis, and it states that some of our illnesses are and problems are from humans not being fit for our modern lifestyle, not being fit for our new environment that we created. And how do we create it? Well, that's where we talk about cultural evolution. Cooperation, big brains, they have greatly contributed to our success as humans. Without us having bigger brains, we wouldn't be able to cooperate. Without being able to cooperate, we may not be here today. All right, us being able to cooperate is what made us ultimately better, we think, than Neanderthals or Homo erectus, and so on. So cultural evolution outweighed biological evolution in recent history because it's much faster, much more rapid changes over time. And part of cultural evolution involved farming, industrial revolution, these changes ultimately completely changed our lifestyle, and really everything about the way that we live and what we do and being fit for our environment and surviving in our environment. Those things drastically changed us. And changes in lifestyle led to more stress, overeating, and poor sleep, which all contributed to obesity. So what I don't I just that's kind of what I have for you guys. As far as I'm concerned, I think you should go back and look at the notes that you've taken throughout the semester to refresh. You should also look at the study guides that you made from the study guides that I provided for you, and make sure that you're fresh for the exam. So I wish everyone the best of luck, and I will see you for our final exam.